towards his purpose, and then God used him in mighty ways to defeat the giant Goliath. A boy, untrained, unready, but filled with the power of the Holy Spirit. And then last week we talked about how David, though he was called and he was anointed, he had not yet been appointed to the position that God had called him into. He had to wait for 20 years while the evil king, who was still anointed by God, was constantly tracking him down, trying to kill him. And every time that David had the chance to take Saul's life, he held back, believing that that was the Lord's anointed, and he would not dare touch the Lord's anointed. That God appointed Saul to his position, and until God removed him, David was not going to play God. And at the end of last week, we learned how David, filled with the Spirit of God, finally became the king, and he reunited the people of Israel. And I love all the great stories about David. The whole book of 1 Samuel shows us the love and the passion and the fire and the conviction that this young man had. But he, like us, was human. David made some mistakes. David made a lot of mistakes. David made decades of mistakes. And that's what I want to talk about this morning, because the Bible is not just fluff. It's not just happy stories. The Bible is real life that tells us that sometimes we get ourselves into real messes, but God can really get us out. See, David had 10 years as being king of prosperity, of victory, of unity with all the different nations of Israel, of a family. He had wives. He ended up with 19 sons alone. David was a blessed man, and God used him mightily in the book of 2 Samuel. That's wrong. Okay, that's okay. 2 Samuel. But after 10 years of God doing great things in his life, after 10 years of success, after 10 years of passionately following the will of God, David decides that he deserves a break. David decides that he deserves a break. The Bible says that while kings went off to war, like David should have been, David decided to send his nephew Joab, the general, into battle. And David decided to take a vacation from the call of God in his life. David knew that God had said that if he was leading Israel's armies, God would bless them and give them victory and bless him. But now he's letting other men take the flag after 10 years. David did not persist in his position. He did not persist in his responsibility, and therefore he stepped outside the will of God. And for the first time in David's life, he begins to walk according to the flesh and not according to the Spirit, just like we humans do. If there was a giant curve that showed the success and failure of David's life, the high and the low, this is the pinnacle where all of a sudden things start to turn for David. And it begins the darkest 20 years of his life. The darkest decades of David's entire life. But David's downfall began not with some great sin, but simply with a decision to stop pursuing God with all his heart, mind, soul, and strength. For the first time ever, David has decided that he wants to enjoy the benefits of the kingdom without having to be the king. David decides that he wants to enjoy the benefits and not the burdens, the comforts and not the conflicts, the fame but not the frustration, the luxury without having to be the leader. And David decides to walk away from what God had called him to do. But only for a little while. I'm just going to take a break, David says. I'm just going to let Joab fight this battle while I sit back and hang out on my balcony. And you all know the story. While David was sitting on his balcony, he looked over and he saw another man's wife taking a bath, whose name happened to be Bathsheba, because that's just a fun coincidence. And he sees this woman who is another man's wife. It's actually one of David's mighty men who served with him in battle, who fought beside him. But David decides that since her husband is away at war like he should be, David is free to enjoy the comforts of his position. So he takes Bathsheba and he brings her to his chambers, and you all know the story. He sleeps with her, sends her home, and then he gets the consequences of his sin. She's pregnant. And he tries to hide the pregnancy. He tries to hide it from Uriah, but Uriah wasn't falling into the temptations that David was setting for him. And so David kills Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. And everything is great because David thinks since he's the king, he can get away with such a thing. God has anointed him and blessed him so much that he can do whatever he wants now, until Nathan the prophet shows up and knocks on David's door and says, David, God knows what you did. And it said, the Lord said, David, I gave you everything, and I would have given you more. And then you did this. And now there will be consequences. Now David grieves because he knows the consequences are coming. But instead of returning to his position, he retreats into his pain. Instead of climbing out of the pit of his sin, he slips deeper and deeper into his shame. David doesn't overcome the sin, accept the consequences, and move on. David begins a 20-year cycle of stepping farther and farther away from God. It wasn't just the fact that he sinned. It was the fact that after he sinned, he decided that now his relationship with God was severed. This is the power of sin in your life. It is that when you sin, you get convicted. The devil comes in like a flood with condemnation and tells you that you can't be one of God's people anymore. You can't be a servant of God. God doesn't want you in that position anymore. And so now David starts to lack his responsibilities. And then over the next 10 years, his victory starts to turn into defeats. The prosperity turns into famine and plague in his country. His humility gets transformed into pride. His worship turns into mourning. And David decides to follow his ways instead of God's ways. This constant cycle, farther and farther and farther, slow, like a frog boiling in water. You ever hear that parable? If you put a frog in a boiling pot of water, it'll jump back out. But if you put a frog in some lukewarm water, why it's a frog in the story, I don't know. You're making frog soup. But if you put a frog in lukewarm water and slowly increase the heat, it'll sit there and boil to death. And that's what's happening to David. Decades are going by, and David is slowly dying. We have to learn that Christianity cannot just be a hobby or a daily pick-me-up or just a good family tradition. A relationship with God has to be a passionate, personal pursuit for Him every day, every moment, with every thought of your life. Living by the Spirit literally means to live by the Spirit, to walk the walk, to talk the talk, to fight the good fight, and to finish the race. There's no such thing as a holiday from being holy. But David deserved a break. And he took that break for 20 years. And then after 10 years of his cycle going farther and farther in, David's got some family problems. And that's really what I want to talk about this morning. See, David's oldest son, the heir to his throne, his name was Amnon. And Amnon had a half-sister, David's daughter, from another woman. His sister from the same mister. Thank you, millennials. And Amnon looks at Tamar, his sister, and thinks that he's in love with her. In fact, the Bible says that he was so in love with her that he tormented himself and literally made himself sick thinking about his sister. So he's lying in bed one day, grieving, mourning, literally sick. And David, his loving father, comes to him and says, "What can I do to make you feel better?" And Amnon says, "You know what? I would love if Tamar made me some lunch." And so David, unaware of what's going on, decides to send Tamar to Amnon. And the Bible says that Amnon took hold of her and he assaulted her, and she tried to resist, but he overcame her. Family problems. And it says that when King David, and in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 21, it should be up on the screen. When King David heard all these things, he rose up and punished Amnon. No, that's not what it said. I'm sorry. It says that when David heard all of these things, David was angry. And then he did nothing. It said that he was grieved. He was upset. I can imagine David hearing this is angry and frustrated and overwhelmed and feeling guilty that he's the one that set the whole thing up. David doesn't know what to do. And in the moment of frustration and fear and confusion, David decides to do nothing. David decides to step back from the burden of responsibility. He decides not only that he doesn't want to be the king, but he doesn't want to be the father in this situation. He decides to step back and ignore the whole thing. David becomes passive, docile. He decides to ignore the problem. But ignoring the problem never makes it go away. You couldn't ignore Goliath until he went away. You couldn't ignore Saul until he went away. You can't ignore these problems. And David, for the first time, is deciding to do nothing. So Tamar, grieved that her father has done nothing to bring her justice, goes to her little brother, Absalom, who's 16 at the time. Absalom is the same age that David was when he fought Goliath. And Absalom brings Tamar into his house and takes care of her for the rest of her life. And it says that while David grew angry but did nothing, verse 22 says, but Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. See, while David was hoping that the problem would go away, Absalom plotted his revenge. For 2 years, David did nothing and was happy that everything had gone away. 2 years of no problems in the family. They just ignored each other. They're probably over it. And then one day, Absalom comes to David and says, I want to throw a party for all my 19 brothers. And I really want Amnon to be there, he says. And David, just so sure that the problem solved itself, tells them all to go. And the Bible says that Absalom, while they were at the party, Absalom had Amnon assassinated in front of all of his brothers. This is the heir to the kingdom. The next in line, Absalom kills him in front of everybody. Doesn't hide it. It's not a secret. He kills him. And then Absalom runs away. We're going to get into some actual text in a minute, but I want to tell you the story so that we don't have to read 20 years worth of David's history here. I see many of you flipping through your Bibles. Where is he? I'll tell you. We'll get there. It says that Absalom ran away because after Absalom killed the heir to the throne, David did nothing. For 2 years, Absalom ran away. David didn't pursue him. David didn't think about him. It says that David just grieved. He was sad that Absalom had done this, but he did nothing. And after 3 years, after 3 years, Absalom decides, you know what, I'm going to come back and fight the music. I'm going to come back and face my father. And when he comes back, David does nothing. David ignores him. For 2 years, Absalom sits in Jerusalem waiting for David to punish him, to yell at him, to forgive him, to do something. But David does nothing. And after 2 years, Absalom decides to have a little temper tantrum. And he goes over to Joab's field, which was David's general. Went to Joab's field and burned them all down. That's an Old Testament temper tantrum, for those of you who need to know what that is. Actually, Samson did the same thing when he was upset. Burned down people's farms. That's what they did back then. So Joab gets very upset with David because David is doing nothing while Absalom is literally burning down the kingdom. And so Joab comes to David and says, David, you need to do something about your son. And so David agrees to have Absalom come before him. And it says that when Absalom came, David looked at him and he kissed him and he sent him away. David did nothing. And in doing nothing, David created a monster. David created Absalom, who was going to cause him all sorts of problems. See, in this moment when David kissed him and sent him away, Absalom realized 3 things. Number 1, he realized that he could do anything he wanted, and David wasn't going to stop him. Number 2, he realized that David was a weak king who was not fit to rule. And number 3, Absalom realized he wanted to be king. And here's where we get into the text this morning. 2 Samuel chapter 15. 2 Samuel chapter 15. I'm going to start at verse 1. It says, after David kissed him and sent him away, after this, Absalom got himself a chariot and some horses, and 50 men to run before him, a little parade for himself. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, from what city are you? And when he said, your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel, Absalom would say to him, see, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you. Let me explain to you what's happening right here. I brought up an illustration. It's not just because I'm tired and lazy and I sing really loud, but because you all need to see the chair for a second. So there's this chair in Jerusalem. It was called the judgment throne. Anybody ever heard that word before? The judgment throne was a place in the inner gate, in between the outer gate and the inner gate. It was this place where the king would sit almost every day. And people from all the lands would come to him and tell him their problems. Situations have happened. I'm having the dispute. The neighbor's cow ate my grass. Little problems, big problems. So-and-so took the inheritance from me. Big problems, little problems. But they would come to the king, and the king would come up with the decision, would be the judge. The problem is that David decided he doesn't want to be judge anymore. We've talked about this. For the last 10 years, David hasn't been to the throne. And you know what's happening in the nation of Israel? Problems. And David is doing nothing. So the throne is sitting there, and it says that Absalom stood next to the throne every day. Early in the morning, made sure he beat the morning rush. And he stood there. And when people came with their problems, he said, Dad's not here. And that's sad, because you guys really need a king right now. And Absalom would say, verse 4, oh, that I were the judge of this land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him judgment. Oh, that I were the king. I would solve all your problems. But unfortunately, we're stuck with my dad, and he's up there, and he doesn't care about any of you. And the throne sat there empty. David did nothing. Verse 5. And whenever a man came near to pay homage to Absalom, Absalom would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Thus Absalom did in all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Absalom starts to play the position that David was supposed to. Next, we see that Absalom sends a message to all of Israel. Sends out messengers to every tribe that says that the day is going to come when I am going to overthrow my father. Are you with me or not? And more often than not, the people said, yeah, we love you. You care about us, Absalom. You got to be careful who you let stand in the seat for you. Who is it that's watching your children and feeding into their ears? Who is it that's being the leader of your household? Be careful who is sitting or standing by the throne, because what happens next is that the messengers came to David. The messengers came to David saying that the hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom. The men come to David and say, David, something is happening. Absalom is starting a rebellion. He's doing it. The people love him. And David said to all of his servants, verse 14, who were with him at Jerusalem, arise, let's flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. This, for me, is the saddest moment in David's entire life. It wasn't the situation with Bathsheba. It was this moment where the enemy comes at the door of David, the king, and David says, let's go. I'm done. This is the same man that when the lion came to steal a sheep, he grabbed it by the beard and killed it. This is the same man that stood before the giant Goliath with an entire army of people cowering behind him. And he stood before the giant with literally a stick and a stone and killed the giant. This is the same man that took a ragtag bunch of rebels in the mountains and turned them into the mighty men of Israel. And now his son, has taken everything from him. And David says, I quit. I'm done. Every single one of us has been given a responsibility. Parenting, jobs, evangelism, your own personal life, your own personal walk. And there's often times when the burden of responsibility is heavy. But when we walk away, when we give up, we lose everything that God called us to. He lost his position. He surrendered his purpose. He surrendered the passion of God. He surrendered his position and his people. And at this moment, David had strayed so far from God for so long that he lost everything that made him David. He lost his first love. And it all came from a long line of condemnation and apathy. He lost everything. Verse 15. And the king's servants said to the king, behold, your servants are ready to do whatever you want to do. The men rise up and say, David, if you want to fight, we're with you. Anything you want. And he says, great, you're with me? Help me pack. Verse 30. But David went up to ascend the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot, and with his head covered. And all the people who were with David covered their heads, and they went up, weeping as they went. David, the mighty giant killer, the shepherd boy that God handpicked, the man after God's own heart, is running away. Defeated, surrendered, given up. And you know, it's Thanksgiving time, and we're supposed to talk about what we're thankful for. I am very thankful that this is not the end of David's story. Because if it was, David would not be the great king that we know and love. David would not be the man that went down in history. David would not be the sculpture that's sitting in Italy. David's story does not end here, but not because of what David did, but the fact that David had some friends. See, David had some friends who did not feel defeated. David had some friends, some soldiers who were still willing to fight. David had some mighty men who remember the king that David used to be and could be again. David had some men that were in the cave with him when he cut Saul's robe. And they remember that David said that Saul was the Lord's anointed, and that until the Lord took him out, he was still going to be the Lord's anointed. And these people decide that God is not done with David yet. So while David is sitting back in the camp, in the woods, in the wilderness, hiding in a cave, his men gather arms. Sometimes you need people that will fight for you even when you won't. Sometimes you need friends in your church, in your family, that are willing to take up arms and pray for you even when you have given up all hope. And that is what David had. He had his mighty men. And so it said that the army went out to fight against Absalom's army of Israel. And the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim, and the men of Israel were defeated by the servants of David. And the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. So David's the men who he led in retreat go back and kill 20,000 of Absalom's men and win the war. It says the battle spread all over the face of the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And Absalom just so happened to meet the servants of David, David's friends. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under a thick branch of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was separated between heaven and earth, while the mule was under where he went. Fancy language. The thing was that Absalom, earlier in the book, it tells us that Absalom was famous because he was really, really cute. It said there was nobody in all of Israel that was as cute as David, as Absalom. That's my translation. But it said there was no man that could equal his beauty and splendor and all that stuff. But one of Absalom's greatest qualities was the fact that he had luxurious locks. He had beautiful, long hair. And that hair, it said that every time he cut it, it would weigh 2 pounds. It's a lot of hair. people. And so Absalom is riding through the woods, trying to escape the army that is now charging after him. And as he's running away, his luxurious locks that he always took so much pride in, took so much vanity in, now are the thing that get him caught in the tree. And it says that he's literally hanging from the branch between heaven and earth, hung by the top of his head. I can sit here and in my imagination, I think about God holding that branch. Dangling Absalom, his little feet hanging behind him. And then it says that Joab found Absalom, verse 14. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. But 3 javelins wasn't enough through the heart, because then 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. They killed Absalom. They killed the threat that was after David. They did what David for 20 years would not do. And then in verse 30 it says, and the king, who was now the king again, wept. He was deeply moved, verse 33, and went up to the chamber over the gate, and he wept. And as he went, he said, O Absalom, my son, O Absalom, would I have died instead of you? O Absalom, my son, my son. And so he sits here and grieves, not just for the death of his son, but for the fact that everything was his fault. David could have stopped this at the very beginning, but he let it go. He let it slide. He wasn't sitting in the throne. Everything that Absalom did, he did because David wasn't being the king that he was supposed to be. David wasn't being the father that he was supposed to be. Chapter 19, verse 1. This is near the end here. It said, it was told Joab heard, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day that the king is grieving. This mighty army that just won David back the kingdom hears that he is weeping, and they grieve. Their day of victory turns into a day of mourning, which is the exact opposite of what God said he is to do in our lives. He's to turn our mourning into victory. But David, still walking by the flesh, still fixated on everything that has gone wrong, cannot see the victory that was just won for him. And the people stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed after they flee a battle. So the people walked in as though they were a defeated army, back into Jerusalem. The king covered his face and cried aloud with a loud voice, O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son. And here comes my favorite part of the story, verse 5. This is where we're going to wrap it up here. It says, then Joab, this is good. Then Joab came into the house of David. Now mind you, number one, Joab is David's nephew, and he's his general. He is not the king. He does not have any kind of authority whatsoever over David. But listen to the way that he talks to David. Then Joab came into the house of the king and said, you have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and of your daughters and of the lives of your wives and of your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants mean nothing to you. For today, I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead, you'd be happy. Verse 7. Now therefore, get up, arise, and go out and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. He says, David, if you don't get your butt out of your room and be the king, you're going to lose everything. Sometimes there's a difference between being loving and being nice. David needed a really hard slap in the face to get him out of this 20-year cycle. David needed a Joab to get up and speak the truth to them, even though he didn't want to hear it. David needed a Joab who was fed up with David being a pansy and a victim and wanted David to be the victor that he used to be. It says, then the king, last verse. Verse 8. Then the king, he got up and he took his seat at the gate. And it says that all the people were told, behold, the king's back. And all the people came before the king. Now Israel had fled, every man to his own home. It says the king is back. David got up and sat in his throne, and for the first time after 20 years, he decided to take up the responsibility that he was called to do. Now, I love this part so much because it tells me that even though David, after 20 years, made mistake after mistake after mistake, got farther away from God, defeat after defeat, depression after depression, falling deeper and deeper and deeper, year after year, decade after decade, even after 20 years of a mess, God still looked down from heaven and said, David, you're still my chosen man. So there are those in this room that maybe you used to be on fire for God. You used to have that passion, that fight. You were looking for those lions to take them by the mane to rescue the little sheep. But after years of mistakes, after years of apathy, things have gotten a little bit out of control. And you're looking back and saying, I used to be a greater man of God. I used to be a greater woman of God. And I'm here to tell you this morning that you still are called to be that same person and greater. God is still calling you to sit on the throne of the responsibilities that He put you in, to be in the ministries that He called you to. Get up out of your bed, get up off your butt and sit back in the throne that He called you to. We as Christians, we're not called to be passive. We're not called to be docile. See, David knew that there were times when he needed to sit in the pasture and just worship God. And there were times when David needed to be in the cave and allow God to have his time with Saul. But there were times where David needed to stand up and say, I'm going to take down this giant. We got too many giants in this church that have been around for way too long. The king got up. He took a seat. And all of Israel said, the king is back. I want to welcome the worship team to come on up. We're going to have some time of response here. Because some of you needed a Joab, or an Abishai, or an Eliab, his brother who hated David at first. Now he's fighting for him to make him king again. But before we do that, I want to speak to a couple individuals, a couple groups in this church. First, I want to speak to the parents and the grandparents. Do not let your children and your grandchildren drift into defeat. Do not let them slip into despair. Do not let them be the leaders of your household. For the young people in this room, life is going to get hard. Life is going to get difficult. Jobs are going to get hard. People you're going to meet are going to be nasty. You're still called to be the man and woman of God that you were called to be. Do not let hard times cause you to give up, or you will never be the person God called you to be. To the leaders in this room, the future leaders in this room, be careful who you let sit on the throne. Be careful who you let into the ministries. Be careful who you let with a microphone. Be careful who you let into your confidence, who you tell your deepest, darkest secrets to. And to all the members of this church, all the saints of God, there is a commission that each of us were called to. There is a responsibility that we were instructed to do, to go out and to reach the lost, and yet we sit back and say, somebody else will do it. See one will do it. Jesse will do it. The missionaries, we'll just pay money and we'll let them do it. God called us to step up with that great commission to reach the lost. How many of us have spent 20 years sitting in our palace, not out to war? We're called to pray, to stand and fight, because the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. As many swords as I have in my office, none of them are used for weaponry. We're called to stand together and to pray and to fight together, to fight for one another, to bear each other's burdens, to stand up next to the defeated Davids as a Joab and an Abishai and say, I'm going to fight for you. You don't have to. To quote Samwise Gamgee from Lord of the Rings, I may not be able to carry your burden for you, but I can carry you. Thank you, millennials, for laughing. I love you guys. So I want to open up these altars today for a people that feel the call back to the throne, that feel the call back to the responsibility that God called them to, the call that has been apathetic as of late, the call to more. So we're going to sing this morning. I'm going to ask you all to please stand with me, and if you want to come down, you're welcome to.